Our lead tonight is Operation Kaveri, a rescue operation launched by the Government of India to bring Indians to safety. Thousands of them are caught in the Sudan conflict. We've been telling you about this fighting and what's been happening there. Now, India is pulling out its nationals. Yesterday, 500 Indians were rescued, and in the days ahead, more will be returning home. There's a ceasefire in place now. It was brokered by the United States, and the United Nations is monitoring the situation.
I am in constant contact with the parties to the conflict, and I've called on them to de-escalate tensions and to return to the negotiating table. We will continue our efforts with our partners to secure a permanent halt to the fighting as soon as possible.
The ceasefire comes after 10 days of heavy fighting. It was so bad that Khartoum, the capital of the Sudan, turned into an active war zone. Quick primer. The Sudan is a country in Northeast Africa, one of the largest on the continent, also one of the poorest in the world. It's a predominantly Muslim country and it has been caught in conflict. In 2021, there was a coup in the Sudan. The generals began running the country and now they're fighting for power and control. On one side is General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. He leads the Sudanese army. He's also the de facto president. On the other side is General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo. He heads a paramilitary force called the RSF, the Rapid Support Force, RSF. Now, the RSF has close to 100,000 members. The debate is over who controls them and essentially who leads the country. And these two generals were once friends and allies. Together, they toppled a dictator just 2 years ago, and now they're fighting each other for power. The clashes began on the 15th of April. More than 400 people have been killed so far. At least one of them is said to be an Indian. There have been multiple attempts to stop the fighting. This is the fourth ceasefire announcement. The previous three in the last 10 days, were unsuccessful. What about this one? For the moment it's holding. They've declared a 72-hour-long truce. It's a narrow window to carry out evacuations, and it's a tricky and dangerous setting. New Delhi is attempting a daring rescue of Indians. How many of them are there? Close to 3,000 Indians are said to be in the Sudan. They're stranded across the country, and India is using all possible channels to rescue them. In the initial days, India relied on allies. Saudi Arabia and France pulled out some Indian nationals. We told you about this yesterday too. Saudi Arabia rescued 3 Indians. France rescued another 5. But many more remain stuck. So India has now deployed its own assets to get them out. This week, India moved 2 military aircraft and 1 naval ship for the operation. The ship, called INS Sumeda, is docked at Port Sudan. Port Sudan is some 850 kilometers from the capital, Khartoum, and the capital is the current battleground. It's also where most people are stranded. The plan is to get Indian nationals to Port Sudan, to get them to board the ship, and to bring them home. Here's what Prime Minister Modi said about the operation.
सूडान में गृह युद्ध के कारण हमारे अनेकों देशवासी फंसे हैं। हमने ऑपरेशन कावेरी का अभियान शुरू किया है और वहां से हमारे लोगों को सुरक्षित लाने का काम प्रारंभ हो चुका है और उसकी निगरानी के लिए हमारी केरल की ही संतान और मेरी सरकार के मंत्री मुरलीधरन जी को मैं उसकी निगरानी के लिए वहां भेज रहा हूं ताकि ऑपरेशन कावेरी बहुत तेज गति से हम सफलतापूर्वक पूर्ण करें।
Why call it Operation Kaveri? Well, Kaveri is an Indian river. It flows through 2 southern states, Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. And it so happens that a lot of the Indians stuck in the Sudan belong to the state of Karnataka, hence the name Operation Kaveri. Apparently, the Prime Minister himself chose this name. And this is not the first time that India has named a rescue mission after a river. Last year, remember, when the war in Ukraine began, India launched Operation Ganga. Ganga, as you would know, is another major Indian river, and the rescue operation from Ukraine was named after it. But this time, there's a political debate over the name and the operation itself. The state of Karnataka is going to the polls next month. It's a high-stakes battle between the ruling BJP and the opposition Congress party. Now, critics say the government is politicizing the rescue effort and that the name Kaveri is aimed at attracting voters in Karnataka. The government, on its part, has slammed the attempt to play politics on a rescue mission. Now, we don't want to dwell on the politics, so we leave it at that. Let's instead focus on another aspect of this story. What were all these people doing in the Sudan? Why were some 3,000 Indians there in the first place? A lot of you may not be aware of this, but India-Sudan connection dates back some 150 years. Some members of the Indian community have lived in the Sudan for decades. The first Indian to visit the Sudan was said to be a Gujarati, a trader who traveled to Sudan from Aden in the year 1856. Once there, he got his friends and family to join him. The community grew. Today, it has some 1,200 Indians. They live there. Then there were those who went to work. Some 2,500 to 3,000 Indian citizens work in different sectors of the Sudanese economy. Some are employed with local UN missions. And India itself has had deep interest in West Africa. In the 1950s, India helped the Sudan organize its first general elections. India's election commission was involved in the effort. And that's not all. Indian engineers helped in setting up the local railway network, also the sugar factories. Experts say India also played an important role in the birth of South Sudan. It's a separate country. It was created more than a decade back, and its creation ended a civil war that had dragged for almost 50 years. India was one of the first countries to open a consulate in South Sudan. In the year 2011, India recognized the government of South Sudan. In 2016, India carried out a similar rescue mission there. Clashes had broken out in South Sudan, and India rescued its citizens from there. So this is not new territory for India or for Indians. They remain engaged in the region largely because of the oil reserves in the Sudan. Indian companies hold stakes across energy assets and blocks. So any conflict in the Sudan impacts India in more ways than one. The immediate priority, of course, is to bring Indians to safety, but India should not hesitate in stepping up, in engaging with all its partners and ensuring that the ceasefire leads to a permanent truce. Email exchanges from inside the BBC, they talk about the risk of violating Indian laws. It's easier to rake up the freedom of speech debate, but does it give anyone a free pass to knowingly violate the law? America supports India because it needs India's support in return. And India is working with the US because it suits India's interests. This is how geopolitics works. Last night, he diffused a crisis with his defense minister. But today, Netanyahu was confronted with a new problem. His cabinet seems to have rebelled against him. The UK is looking at the Indian subcontinent to fill its coffers. That India seems to be negotiating from a position of power, like a partner and not a former colony.